morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Monday, July 19th, 2021. Today, I've got the fourth of a series of episodes covering the papers of one of the most prominent anti-federalist writers, Brutus. And on this episode, I'm going to share more of his views on representation. And basically, he took the position that under the federal structure, under the Constitution, based on the number of people in Congress, it was actually impossible to properly to even represent the people. There was no way. He used the word impossible to have representation. And his prediction of the outcome, I think, was pretty spot on. He said it would lead to bribery, corruption, and a government, not a free government, one of voluntary compliance, but one of coercion and force. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is everything you need to follow this program. All the archives for over 3 years now. Individual episodes like this one. I won't have too many links today, but you can read the source documents that I'm referencing and learn more in context on your own time. You can find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like Facebook and YouTube and Twitch and Twitter, but just in case you notice some Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, or when you're looking for the archives that were no longer available on your favorite social platform, let's say we're out of there, it might happen at some point, we're on a bunch of others like library.tv and odyssey.com. We're on Gab TV and MeWe and Minds and Brighteon and BitChute and BitTube and Hyper and all over the place. You can find also all the podcast editions. We just do audio only over at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, iHeartRadio, and the rest. And of course, our membership program is just starts out as little as $2 a month. And I can't thank you guys enough for putting your financial faith behind our work. Nothing helps us get the job done. Roll up our sleeves every single day, brick by brick, person by person, build a foundation for the Constitution and liberty than the support of our members. I'm rambling at this point. Our show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. A quick thank you to a handful of the people who have joined us as members recently. There are many others, but I want to say a quick hello to Robin in Tennessee, Douglas in Nevada, Greg in Georgia, Toby in New Hampshire. Thank you. Caleb, Missouri, a restart. Thank you, my brother. Don in Georgia, Krista in Colorado, and everyone else, thank you so much. Let's say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat while we're allowing people another moment or so to join us, get notifications for the live stream. There's Dixie Strong, that Liberty Gallon DFW, Tim Martin, Patricia Dance, MRGF, Melissa Harrell in Montana, Clay Kent, Tyler B., Dan Reed, Culinary Libertarian Podcast. Make sure to check that one out. Donald Maggart, Rachel Menard, Melody Skaman, and everyone else, thank you so much for being here. And let's get right to this. I want to point out again, this is the fourth paper that I've covered, fourth episode, and I'm going to go through all these Brutus papers. I'll probably go through some of the Cato ones. I should do more and more of this so we can see all the different views and warnings from Federalist and Anti-Federalist alike, even though those terms were actually terms of propaganda. The Anti-Federalists, for example, thought they were the real Federalists, and the Federalists were the consolidation supporters. They were the nationalists or the central government supporters, consolidated power. So I created a page on our 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. As you scroll through it, first you start out at the top and it lists all the platforms, and then I've broken it down so I do so many different types of topics. I talk about nullification strategy, nullification news. I do quotes from the founders. I've talked about federal courts and the banking system. And so I've started to really, really expand the various sections on that page that are covered. So if you just like a particular topic or a few of them, you can scroll through and find more. I just added one over the weekend because I knew I was going to be doing this episode on Brutus's fourth paper. Way at the bottom is Brutus's Anti-Federalist papers. There's only 3 there so far. But so far I've covered things like centralization of power and consolidation. Brutus had a natural rights foundation. He talked about the 3/5 clause and some on representation. And that brings me to founderoftheday.com, which is a really nice resource, really this brief chunks of information, and I've cited that site a number of times on this show, talking about Brutus's paper number 4, published November 29, 1787, and this is how they put it. Anonymous anti-federalist author Brutus begins his fourth paper by continuing where he left off in the third. representation. He contends that a government can only rule in one of two ways. You've got two options when it comes to government. And I know many of my friends would say it's only the latter. But either you're going to get support of the people or by force. And here's how Brutus put it. The first sentence after "to the people of the state of New York." Remember, Brutus and then especially the Federalist Papers were primarily drafted for a New York audience. And the Federalist Papers really didn't have much influence outside of New York during the ratification debates and has an outsized impact today. But many of the Brutus Papers were kind of a debate with Publius from the Federalist. Here's how Brutus kicks off. There can be no free government. There can be no free government. I mean, that really hammers it home. Where people are not possessed of the power of making the laws by which they are governed, like a voluntary association. That's my words. Either in their own persons or by others substituted in their stead. So you can delegate authority of someone to manage a store, to manage your home, to run your rental company, to do all kinds of stuff. People in their day-to-day lives, they delegate authority to other people to do all kinds of stuff for them. And he's saying, look, you can only be free, you can only have a free government if the people are actually in charge of making the laws. They are possessed of the power of making the laws by which they are governed. And then that is either by themselves or someone else. Going further, he focuses on having proper representation. Following up on his third essay, he says, however fair an appearance any government may make. So no matter how good it looks on paper, if the people aren't actually represented, it's going to lead to bad stuff down the line. Even if you have people doing the right thing today, sooner or later, without proper representation, we're going to have a bunch of pitfalls. And that's what he gets into in this paper. He says, however fair an appearance any government may make, though it may possess 1,000 plausible articles and be decorated with ever so many ornaments, no matter how good the structure is, if it is deficient in this essential principle of a full and just representation of the people, it will only be like a painted sepulcher. I've never known how to say that word. I've only learned about it from reading, I guess, back when I was a kid. For without this, it cannot be a free government. Let the administration of it be good or ill. It will still be a government not according to the will of the people, but according to the will of a few. So even if they're doing the right thing, John Dickinson and so many of the other early revolutionaries and old revolutionaries and founders talked about this as well. The notion that just because government is doing the right thing doesn't mean you're free. It could mean that you're just lucky. Dickinson specifically, he was the penman of the Revolution, specifically said, just because they're doing the right thing, you are not a free people. You're only free if government is so limited that it can't violate your rights. And that doesn't mean limited on paper, but limited in structure and limited by the response of how the people deal with stuff when they violate the rules on paper, the words on paper. So that's what Brutus is picking up in this long tradition, this long understanding of the American principles, that even if you have good people doing the right thing, but if they have too much power, sooner or later, other people are going to get in office and have too much power, and therefore you're not in control of the government. This is not a free people. You're actually ruled. It's ruled versus, well, whatever else we want to call it. Back to founder of the day, they say Brutus reminds us then of his prior paper's thesis, number 3, that too few members would be chosen for the House of Representatives. He also talked about the 3/5 clause. They go on, as they would be removed from their representatives, the people will not know them and therefore have no confidence in them. How can someone be your representative if they don't know you? They don't know your thoughts. They don't know your views. They're just looking at polls and whatever makes them popular is really how it plays out today. They're not true House of Representatives, according to Brutus, and I actually agree with him here. I don't agree with all the anti-federalist positions, but I think he was really, really on to something with this. You aren't truly represented if it's a single person telling everybody what it's going to be. Furthermore, they write, this intermittent distance would lead to corruption and bribery as a small group of rulers slowly consolidated power. And over time, they have certainly consolidated power, centralized it, and today we live under the largest government, the largest military empire in the history of the planet. That is not a free government. That is as far as the world has ever been from a free government, the furthest. Brutus goes on. He says, so small a number could not resemble the people, because he thought the word representation meant represent. And if you're going to have, let's say you have 10 people and 4 of them have one view and 4 of them have another view and 2 of them have a third view. In order to represent those 10 people, you have to have the right number of representatives, the right kind of balance, a number of people. You have to have 40%, 40%, and 20%. And if you only have one representative, it's impossible. If you only have 2, you can't have 40%. If you only have 3, you still can't do it. So he's using it as a numbers game to be able to properly represent. How could you actually do that? I don't know. I don't know if it really gets into the logistics of that, but he's pointing out, like, look, because this is impossible, you can't let the government get involved in stuff that should be local issues. You can't have any centralization of power because this representation is impossible and it's going to lead to stuff. He says the choice of the members would then commonly fall upon the rich and the great, the big, powerful people, while the middling class of the community would be excluded. You don't see too many average Joes, average Janes making it all the way to Congress. They're generally part of the system. And there's a reason for that, because it is the rich and the powerful, as Brutus warned us. He says that in so small a representation, there was no security against bribery and corruption. He warned us. And he goes on. He says the firmest security, according to him, against this kind of improper and dangerous influence, as well as all other, is a strong and numerous representation. In such a house of assembly, so great a number, didn't actually give the number, but he's saying it has to be so large a number that it must be gained over before the private views of individuals could be gratified, that there could be a scarce hope of success. So it would be so many people that the lobbying, the power, the money, the influence, it's so much more difficult. A lobbyist with a certain amount of cash on them, they can influence 100 people much easier than they could influence maybe 10,000. It's much harder to buy all those people off, and it becomes much more obvious to the general public. He says, but in the Federal Assembly, 17 men, at least at that time, if you're thinking about quorums, what's the minimum amount of people that have to assemble in the House of Representatives? 17 men are all that is necessary to pass a law. 17 men. And now today, what do we have, 435 in the House? Quorum then, I think, is then, if I'm doing my math, I went to government-run school, so my math is pretty bad. 216, I think. So then, or 218 is a quorum in the House of Representatives. So half of that means as little as 110 people can make law, rules, and regulations for 300 million plus, 330 million people. That isn't representation. That is ruling. That is power. That is force and authority, just like Brutus warned us. I saw a couple of comments on the preview post from last night over on Facebook. Joshua Campbell pointed out, he says, 1 per 30,000, which is what the original idea was, is way more than 435 per 331 million. And Andy Kane says each congressman now has 760,000 constituents. One person representing, and I'm not sure if those numbers are right, but they seem pretty close to a wild number, where if you were to say, okay, we've got 760,000 people's views, how many people do you think need to properly represent it? The notion that they're all the same is absurd. So I think a lot of people recognize they're not the same, but then they still think that they're voting for a representative. Anyways, on average, it's 1 per 760,000, and each senator is 1.1 per 3.3 million people. Here's Tara Ross's blog on this. She says, Brutus argues that the number of representatives in Congress will be too small. After all, human nature basically guarantees that artful and designing individuals, that was Brutus's terms, when there is power to be exercised, it's going to draw people who want to use and abuse and expand that power. The more power there is, the more that they're going to want to use their power, money, and influence to get in the places of power. Then once they're there, because there's so few people representing so many, they're going to continually expand that power. This was the chain of events that Brutus warned us would happen. Brutus was absolutely correct in how that played out. And she says these men frequently, she's quoting Brutus here. These men frequently possess brilliant talents and abilities. A lot of times they tell us, oh, these representatives are stupid. Maybe they're dumb on certain history, but they certainly are Machiavellian style intelligent. They are power hungry monsters, in my view. They will assume any shape and Proteus-like mold themselves into any form. That's how Brutus described it. If they cannot get their way by bribery, then they will endeavor to mislead by specious and false reasoning. I mean, just nailing it over and over and over. Now, Brutus thinks it's, again, impossible to actually have representation. And I know some of my ANCAP friends will say, no matter how many numbers, you can't have representation. But he certainly does make a case along that line here. And that's why he's arguing, don't let them have so many powers in the central government, in the federal government, because it's going to lead to all kinds of stuff. And he says, in order for the people safely to repose themselves on their rulers, they should not only be of their own choice, but it is requisite that they should be acquainted with their abilities to manage the public concerns and wisdom. If you're running a business, or let's say you own a business, and you're delegating to a business manager to run your business for you, you're going to go through a whole series of interviews. You're going to know the person. Maybe you're going to hire the person on a recommendation because you want to be acquainted with their skills, their abilities, their moral fortitude, their standpoints on stuff, and you want someone to properly represent your company. But yet when it comes to government, it's just whoever happens to be on one team or another, or they happen to support one single issue and everyone's all on board. They're going to throw thousands of dollars at these people, and then in the aggregate, billions and billions of dollars get thrown at people who will never, ever, ever represent us. They just want power. Brutus goes on, he says, they should be satisfied that those who represent them are men of integrity, who will pursue the good of the community with fidelity, and will not be turned aside from their duty by private interest or corrupted by undue influence. But it is impossible, again, it is impossible to have representation under the structure, according to Brutus. It is impossible the people of the United States should have sufficient knowledge of their representatives when the numbers are so few to acquire any rational satisfaction on either of these points. And he goes further. He says, being so far removed from the people, their station will be elevated. They're treated like some special class of people. In fact, sometimes they pass laws that don't even really apply to them. They get away with whatever they want. Rules for thee, but not for me. Being so far removed from the people, their station will be elevated and important, and they will be considered as ambitious and designing. Called it again. They will not be viewed by the people as part of themselves. I don't know about you, but I've never looked at politicians as being one of my crew or one of my people. Some dude I saw on TV or online in a video or an article about, that didn't feel like that was part of my community. Now, maybe you're lucky on a state or a local level. Sometimes you can have that type of connection with a representative or with some politician. But again, I think it's just in a smaller scale, maybe not as bad, but it's the same type of a scenario. They will not be viewed as by the people as part of themselves, but as a body distinct from them and having separate interests to pursue. What a surprise. And here again from Founder of the Day, in his estimation, Brutus said, the further control was removed from the people. So the less represented people were, the more the federal government would have to rely on force to coerce the people into obedience, because you're not actually representing. You're just choosing this side versus that side. And people wonder why things are so partisan. Is because there is too much power, and because there is too much representatives and you can't actually represent the views of the people, you have side A versus side B, and people are going to continue sliding more and more, even when I would argue for most people who tell me they're, oh, I'm this party or I'm that party, most people who tell me that, if I had a short 5-minute conversation with them, I would find that their team betrays them almost all the time on the issues that are important to them. But they just see their side as less bad on that issue or those issues than the other side. And then it just creates this endless cycle of consolidation, centralization, corruption, bribery, plunder and waste, coercion and force. And that's the only way to get people to obedience. And then from there, he actually points to Article 1, Section 4. He's talking about regulating elections, which I think is interesting. But I'll let you guys read that on your own time if you're interested in that part. But then he goes to this gem. He says, if then this government should not... Oh, wait. Okay, here we go. He says, if then this government should not derive support from the goodwill of the people, it must be executed by force, or not executed at all. Either case would lead to total destruction of liberty. The convention, he points out, he thought this was interesting, and this is a really good way of hammering home if you're thinking about getting the word out to people of the time. He says the Philadelphia Convention, they must have seemed aware of this. They must have thought that force was going to be required to compel obedience because they have provided for calling out the militia to execute the laws of the Union in the document itself. And he says, I know, and this is after, I actually jumped ahead. So then he talked about regulating elections, and maybe he thought to himself, the response is, oh, you're getting a little far-fetched on what you're concerned about here. And so he says this, I know it's said that the dangers apprehended from this clause, Article 1, Section 4, are merely imaginary, that the proposed general legislature will be disposed to regulate elections upon proper principles and to use their power with discretion and to promote the public good. It was sold by many on the Federalist side, which is fascinating because so many of them in the years leading up to the Revolution, in the years before the Constitution was considered drafted, proposed, whatever, ratified, that you should never trust anyone with power. Trust no man living with the power to endanger the public liberty. That's how John Adams put it when he was the Atlas of Independence. But once he became a Federalist, he really switched to being more of a big government guy. And so the notion that you're going to just, the structure of the government will lead to drawing in the best and the most moral, the good people, and then they'll just follow those rules. They'll take an oath. An oath would be taken seriously. That didn't last too long at all. Maybe just a couple of years before it really started getting chipped away. And then you know that as soon as they chip away with one step, as Thomas Jefferson told us, a single step beyond the bounds of the Constitution is to take control of a boundless field of power. It's an unlimited power as soon as you can let them take a single step because they're going to build on that foundation and continue to take more. And Brutus is really giving that same message here. Like, look, okay, maybe it's an interesting structure, but I can see how it could be abused. And maybe you think that my views on how this is going to be abused are far-fetched. But you know what? We can't rely on the people to do the right thing. He's actually considering the American revolutionary tradition, which is don't trust anyone. He says, on this I would observe that constitutions are not so necessary to regulate the conduct of good rulers as to restrain that of bad ones. So if you think there's only going to be good ones there, then it's pointless. There's no reason to have a constitution at all. He actually says that. I'm paraphrasing, but he's basically saying if there's only going to be good people in office, we don't actually have to give them all these limits. It's there because we know that government attracts people who want to abuse power, to aggrandize themselves, to enrich themselves on the ruins of public liberty. Going further, he says, power lodged in the hands of rulers to be used at discretion is almost always exercised to the oppression of the people and the aggrandizement of themselves. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. I hope it was thought-provoking. Of course, I'm going to get to the live chat here in just a moment, but I want to remind you that if you want to support the show and help us spread the word, help us trigger the algorithm of the mainstream platforms. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts, smash a like button on Facebook or YouTube, retweet, leave comments, share links. All that stuff tells the algorithm of the platforms to show the program to more people, and it helps out a great deal. Our membership program, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, where you can join us for as little as $2 a month. Let's see if there's any interesting questions. Here, the Salt Lakers on December 23rd, 1913, all bets were off. It was a very bad year, but if you've been following my work more recently as well, 1791 was really the bad year because those were the arguments for a first national bank. These were the times, this is exactly when Thomas Jefferson, his argument in February of 1791, February 15th, just however many months, again, my math, government run school, 10 months before the Bill of Rights was ratified, he specifically cited the foundation of the Constitution as being the 10th Amendment. You can only exercise those powers delegated to the government and nothing else. And as soon as you take a single step beyond that in creating this central bank, you're going to have serious problems. You've taken a boundless field of power in that new central government or that federal government. And those were the same arguments that they made in December of 1913 to reestablish today's more modern, more expansive national bank. Tim Martin, the biggest joke is when congressmen have to cite the Constitution. Yeah, I forget that that's even a thing. They actually have to, and I'm not sure if this happens on every single piece of legislation. Maybe it's a rule in the House, but they do actually have to cite their constitutional authority for what they do. And if you look at this stuff, it's always just absurd. I mean, everything that they pass is somehow constitutional. And we learned many years ago, and I've talked about on this show, that this is how it was called, artful rulers will certainly, I'm just paraphrasing, they will certainly make everything sound as legal as possible. They always cite, Tim Martin says, Article 1, Section 8, like there's nothing else. They just say our powers under Article 1, Section 8. It's nonsense that they even do that. So some people have over the years said, well, make them actually cite the part of the Constitution, and they do that. But then they cite it so broadly and everything fits within that it's just pointless. Salt Lakers, again, the Federal Reserve runs everything. Fuzz fork, and maybe that's what Tim is pointing at. The Constitution should be read openly every day that Congress meets. Well, maybe, I would rather them spend their time on that even if they're not going to follow it. But really, I think what the problem is that people are willing to support these people even when they're bad on the Constitution, which is all the time. And then, as I mentioned briefly before, maybe I should do an episode covering some examples, but people on the right, their team generally is bad on the issues important to them, and people on the left, they're bad on issues that are important to them. So they're actually willing to support people that they really, it's insanity to me, and I don't understand how this keeps happening, but certainly everyone from Brutus the Antifederalist to George Washington, one of the arch-federalists on the other end of the spectrum, took the position that something like this was going to be the end result. Benjamin Franklin told us on the last day of the Philadelphia Convention, September 17th, 1787, we now celebrate that as Constitution Day. He gave the first speech. He made the motion to actually approve the document to send it out to the states. And in his speech, he says, there's parts of this I don't like. But you know what? Let's just go with it. And at the end of the day, it's really the same argument that Brutus made. It doesn't matter what we put on paper, because sooner or later, there's going to be bad people that try to do the wrong stuff with it. We have to get as good as we can. I'm not happy with everything in this. But you know what? What we're going to have is a government administered well for a number of years, and then it will only end in despotism. So it's really interesting that we were told how things were going to play out, but yet people are still okay with supporting Team A versus Team B. JT Bond, you will comply. We have ways of making you comply, comrade. Floyd Looney says the government tries to do everything and does nothing very well. And even if it did things very well, and I think that gets back to Brutus's point as well, just because it's well administered doesn't mean you're a free people. You're still being ruled. It's just that you're being ruled well by a small group. It's not a free system, a government of the people. I mean, that's not the phrase that he used, but it's not what they called a free government. Dan Reed, absolutely right. People support Congress even when they are bad, maybe because they are bad. And that, I think, is something that has really been kind of bubbling under the surface in my head. I'm glad you made that point. Dan, again, does the Culinary Libertarian podcast, which is awesome. But this is a really important point. H.L. Mencken made that great quote some years ago. Democracy is the theory that the people know what kind of government they want and they deserve to get it good and hard. In essence, we're talking about a market response here. If the people don't care about freedom, they don't like freedom, they think freedom is dangerous, then they're certainly going to be okay with these people. Now, some people who want liberty, who want freedom, are going to support one team or another on one issue or another. Maybe they're going to hold their nose. But I think the vast majority of people actually are afraid of liberty. They hate liberty. They like it on some issues, but then they're not consistent, and then you apply it to some other issue, and that's for the other side only. But that's a really great point from Dan Reed. Clay Kent says, if you keep doing things the same way, expecting different results. Yes, insanity. And that's how the founders, when they looked at history, they tried to look at the structure of one thing, the scenario of one thing at one time. And if you repeated it, you shouldn't be surprised when you have the same kind of results. So when you have too much consolidation, too much centralization of power, you shouldn't be surprised when it destroys liberty. And that was really the big debate over consolidation. And that's really what Brutus is, again, talking about here. We know that, as I covered in a previous episode, the first one, actually the first two papers really were about centralization, what the founders often called consolidation of power. The first one, I think, gave the greatest example of why centralization leads to a destruction of liberty. There wasn't a lot of explanation as to why. In general, someone in the Philadelphia Convention or the state ratifying debates, they would just say consolidation. Everyone knew that meant something bad. But in Brutus's first paper, he went through a full list of explaining how it actually leads, what functions it does, and how it actually destroys liberty. And then the second one, he followed up on that a bit, but not in the same type of detail, but using a natural rights foundation as a response to consolidation of power. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope, again, you learned something. I really appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.